Does the world have too many or too few people? Does the world have too many people or too few people? You know, when you ask this question, there's always somebody in the crowd who says, well, wait a minute, how many people can the Earth support? Let's ask that. How many people can the Earth support? Those people are not serious. It's the wrong question, okay? Because when you ask that question, what you're saying, in effect, is that there's such a thing as too many people. And that's true. We know that. There's such a thing as too much of anything. Of course there's such a thing as too many people. That's not the interesting question. The interesting question is, do we currently have too many or too few? Would we like to ramp up the population or to ramp down the population? There's such a thing as too many. There's also such a thing as too few. The question is not that. The question is, do we have too many or too few? To answer that, you've got to look at the benefits and costs of bringing another person into the world. And it's not enough to just look at the benefits and costs. You've got to separate the benefits and costs that are felt by the decision makers from the benefits and costs that spill over onto other people. I'll call those the private benefits and the spillover benefits. Spillover is another word for externality. The point is that the private benefits and costs are not going to go into our public policy calculation. Individuals are already accounting for those. Okay? The guy who pollutes the air, insofar as he's breathing that air himself, that's his choice. There's no reason for anybody to second guess that. That does not enter into the question of whether the world has too much pollution or not. So insofar as the costs affect, who are the decision makers? The decision makers are the parents and the potential parents who are deciding how many children to have. The costs and benefits that are felt by the decision makers are irrelevant to the question of whether we have too many people or not. The important questions are the spillover costs and benefits. So let's think about what goes in each of these boxes. Let's look first of all at the private benefits. Well, the biggest private benefit of having a child is, for most of us, that we love our children. And that, of course, one could expand on that for hours and hours, all of the joy that we get from interacting with our children and from knowing that they're there and from knowing that they love us. That's a huge private benefit. Of course, the decision maker accounts for that. What about on the cost side? Well, if you have a child, you got to feed that child, you got to clothe them, you've got late nights sitting up with them when they're sick. When they get a little older, you're bailing them out of jail. All of those are private costs felt by the parent, felt by the decision maker, and therefore not relevant to the question of whether the world has too many people or not. Okay? If I have a child and I bear all those costs voluntarily, well, it's nobody else's business that I chose to do that. What about spillover costs and spillover benefits? Let's go to the benefits first. First of all, the child you have is not just going to love you, but most of the time is going to eventually love and be loved by other people. Most of the people in this room, I'm guessing, have at some time or another in their lives been loved by somebody other than their parents. That's a benefit you brought to the world. That's a benefit you brought to somebody else that your parents did not fully account for when they decided to have you, okay? Which suggests they might have been having too few children. Of course, we can't conclude that until we finish looking at the costs also. Friendship. It's not just the people you love, it's the people you befriend. Diversity, there's the diversity you bring to the world, okay? Just by being the unique person that you are, and that diversity enables niche interests to thrive. We can't have Ethiopian restaurants or chamber music or parasailing unless there's a critical mass of people who are interested in that. That requires a large population. There are 6 billion people in the world, 7 billion people in the world. About 140 of them wanted to come to Cato University, okay? If there were half as many people, we might not be able to support this activity. We need lots of people to have that kind of diversity. Also, and this is the big one, every child brought into the world has at some point in their life some ideas. Ideas ranging from, hey, let's put on a play, to, hey, let's make computer chips out of silicon. And we saw yesterday how important those ideas are for everyone's prosperity. The ideas that a child has, the point about ideas is they're so easy to copy. They're so easy to copy, they're so easy to improve on, and they live forever. They outlive the person who creates the idea. So when you have a child, every idea that child is ever going to have is a contribution that you have made to the world that you perhaps didn't think about when you were deciding to have that child. All right, that's a lot of benefits to having more kids. What are the costs? The big cost everyone thinks about is resource consumption. If I have a child, that child is going to eat fish, burn gasoline, take up space. But before we put that cost on our chart, we have to think about whether it goes in the spillover box or the private box. And you know, a lot of people get this wrong. They think that resource consumption is always a spillover effect, that resource consumption always hurts somebody else. But that's not true. Okay? The fish that I catch, or the apple that I grow myself that nobody else would have caught or that nobody else would have grown, okay? That resource, if I consume that, that's not hurting anybody. Okay? The resources I create and consume, it's not hurting anybody. The resources I trade for are not hurting anybody. If I grow an apple and trade it for a fish, I haven't hurt anybody. And then, you know, another big source of resources for a large segment of the population, and I'm guessing for the families of a lot of people in this room, is inheritance. We get a lot of our resources not by creating them ourselves, not by trading for them, but because we got them from our parents. Not just financial resources, but all the training we get from our parents, all the teaching that we get about how to behave in the world, all the schooling we get from them, and the financial resources we get from them. Who does that hurt? A lot of people get that wrong too. They think that if your kids weren't inheriting all that stuff, somebody else's kids would be, but that's not true. They think that if I had less, they think that if I weren't here consuming resources, there would be a little bit more for everybody else. That's not true. If I weren't here, there'd be a lot more for these two people, my sisters. The resources that we get from our parents mostly are not taken away from the rest of the world. They're taken away from our siblings. And what's important is your parents cared about those siblings. Your parents cared about those siblings, which means this is a cost they accounted for. Okay? If you have an older brother, the day you were born was the worst day of that older brother's life. Okay? Cut the inheritance in half, cut the parental attention in half. Okay? But your parents who loved that brother thought you were worth it. Okay? They knew what they were doing to him. Okay? And they loved him, and they cared, and they thought you were worth it. Okay? That, in other words, is the sort of decision that nobody else needs to second guess. The consequences are concentrated in the family of decision makers who made that decision. So it seems to me that most resource consumption, if we're deciding where to put it, it goes not in the spillover category, it goes in the private category. The resources we create go in the private category, the resources we trade for go in the private category, and the very substantial resources that we get from our parents largely go in that private category. What about spillover costs of bringing another kid into the world? The big ones are that kid might become a thief, might become a conqueror, might become a major polluter. Okay. How important are those things? I do not know. I haven't collected numbers on this, but my guess is that most people are not thieves, most people are not conquerors, most people are not major polluters. And when I say most people are not thieves, I'm not counting that notebook you shoplifted in 7th grade. But looking at that in the context of all the, comparing it to everything in the box above there with the love, the friendship, the diversity, the ideas, I think a reasonable guess, and I'm acknowledging that this is a guess, is that for most children brought into the world, the stuff in that upper right box dwarfs the stuff in the lower right box. The important point is that the stuff in the left-hand boxes doesn't count. It doesn't matter from the point of view of deciding whether there are too many children in the world or not. Another thing that might go in that box on the lower box on the right is public assistance. Kids who go on public assistance are imposing a cost on the rest of the world. And to do an honest accounting here, we would certainly want to account for that as well. But again, what I want to stress is the importance of not counting the private costs. And let me illustrate in a slightly different way what I mean by that. Here we have two families. They each live on an acre of land. So that's one family's acre and the other family's acre. One family doubles its population every generation, while the other one practices zero population growth. So a generation later, this land's been cut in half. Everybody's living on half an acre. This family over here, they've still got their acre. And a generation later, this one's cut in half, and cut in half, and cut in half again. Eventually, everyone in this family is living on a postage stamp. Everyone in this family is living on an acre. People in this family are going to be poorer. They're also going to have the joy of having a lot more grandchildren. Which is better, to be rich or to have a lot of grandchildren? That's a matter of taste. Okay? It is not a problem that one family made one choice and the other family made another choice. And as long as the choices of this family do not impinge on the choices of that family, there's no reason for this family to complain. The only reasonable basis for a complaint is if this family does start in some way impinging here, again, maybe by starting a war, by becoming thieves. But we have to weigh against that all the positive stuff we get from having this big population over here. This big population is creating ideas, which those people over there can copy. This big population over here is creating diversity, which increases the number of choices available to this family over here. Everybody in this family is a potential lover, a potential friend, a potential mate, a potential somebody who will smile at you as you pass them on the street or stop to help you when your car breaks down. That's what you want to focus on when you're deciding if the world has too many children or not. What are the spillover effects from this family to this family? We don't normally account for those when we're deciding how many children to have. I have one child. It's a daughter. There she is. She's getting married next month. She's getting married to a terrific guy. I have one child. I have one child because that's what I wanted. I weighed costs and benefits. I thought about my family's particular situation, and I said, one's enough. But somewhere in this world, as far as I know, somewhere in this room, there's a young lady, my daughter's age, whose life has been permanently impoverished by my failure to have the son who would have someday swept her off her feet. And if I had cared about that young woman as much as I care about my own daughter, I would have had that son. If I had cared about the rest of the world as much as I cared about my own daughter, I would have had that son. Okay? I just threw that one in to prove we're related. If you are worried, the other issue that comes up when we talk about population is that people worry that the world is too crowded. You know, if you look on the television news, you get the idea that the world looks like that. But if you actually fly over the United States and look out the window, you discover that it really looks like that. There is a lot of space in the world. I know it looks like there are a lot of people when you're walking down the street in New York. The fact is, everyone in the world fits in the Grand Canyon if you stack them right. Or, if you don't like that image, take this one, which I got from Thomas Sowell. Take the state of Texas, divide it up into lots, each the size of the average middle-class house lot in the United States. The average middle-class single-family home in the United States. Take a lot that size, divide the state of Texas up into those lots, put a family of 4 in each of those homes, you have just housed the world's entire population. Fill up Oklahoma with the fast food places and you're all set. It's easy to forget that kind of thing because you see, and this is something that comes up in economics all the time. We overestimate the size of crowds everywhere we go, on average, for the following reason. There's always a lot of people around to observe a crowd, by definition, okay? If your doctor's office is empty half the day and really crowded the other half the day, every one of his patients is going to say it's really crowded all the time, because that's all they ever see, right? This is important, incidentally, when you analyze things like unemployment statistics. You go around and you ask people, how long have you been unemployed? How long have you been unemployed? Well, the people who are unemployed a really long time are very likely to be unemployed on the day when you're asking the question. The people with short durations of unemployment, there's a good chance they're back at work by the time you ask the question. So when you ask a question like that, you sample mostly people with long durations of unemployment. It's the same phenomenon. When you look around you, more people are in crowds than are not, and therefore more people think the world is crowded than don't. It is easy when you are stuck in traffic on a hot summer night to remember that the guy in front of you is imposing a cost and that the world would be better off without him. It is also easy to forget that the guy who invented car air conditioning is conferring a benefit, and that if you halved the world's population, you'd have been as likely to get rid of that guy as this guy. So there is my chart, and it is not definitive. I have not actually attempted to compute what is the fraction of people who become important thieves, what's the fraction of people who become major polluters. What I want to give you here is a way of thinking. The way of thinking says that if not just population, not just sex, not just pollution, but any time anybody asks you, does the world have too much of something or too little, you want to focus on who were the decision makers, B, what incentives were they facing, and C, were their incentives aligned with the spillover effects of their behavior.